Hello everyone, I'm Laurel Griffith and welcome to Sunday School. We are beginning a new unit today, which is a study of worship, and we are going to look at the life of Abram. Our focal passage is Genesis chapter 13, but we are going to begin in Genesis chapter 12. So I want us to read the first 3 verses and then we'll reflect a little on how God is at work in Abram's life. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." So here we see that God initiates a relationship with Abram. He reaches down in Abram's life and calls to him and asks Abram to be willing to leave his all that he knows. He's leaving the community that he knows. He's leaving the religious system that he knows. For in leaving his father's land, he is also leaving behind the gods of the people. And so as he moves to follow God, he is beginning a relationship, a monotheistic relationship with the one true God. Now, the Lord has initiated this relationship with Abram, and this is a part of God's great plan of redemption. For God promises to Abram that he will bless him if Abram follows him, and that he will make his name great, and that he will have many descendants, and through him there will be a great family, and that great family will become a great nation. And through this nation, which is the nation of Israel, all the nations of the world will be blessed. And of course, this is fulfilled in Jesus Christ, when Jesus comes and brings salvation to all nations and all people, because God so loved the world. We see the fulfillment of this promise that's made to Abram in the arrival of the life, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Abram doesn't know any of that. Abram doesn't have a glimmer of what the future holds. He just knows that God has spoken to him, and he responds by faith. So if we continue in Genesis 12, in verse 4, we see that Abraham went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. Abram took his wife Sarai and his brother's son Lot, and all the possessions that they had gathered, and the persons whom they had acquired in Haran, and they set forth to go to the land of Canaan. When they came to the land of Canaan, Abram passed through the land to the place at Shechem, at the oak of Moreh, and that time the Canaanites were in the land. Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your offspring I will give this land." So he built there an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. From there he moved on to the hill country on the east of Bethel, and pitched his tent with Bethel on the west, and Ai on the east, and there he built an altar to the Lord, and invoked the name of the Lord. And Abram journeyed on by stages toward the Negev. So what we see here is that God makes another promise to Abram. Abram builds another altar. He goes to the land of Canaan. He goes to Shechem, and he goes to Bethel. And in each of these places, he builds an altar to the Lord. And God promises Abram there to give him the land. So this relationship that God has with Abram continues to unfold as Abram continues to worship God, to call out to God. God comes and responds and reveals more of his great plan. Now, Abram and Lot and their great family, there's a lot of people, there's a lot of animals that they are responsible for, and we know from later verses that a famine occurs in the land. And so Abram makes the decision to leave Canaan and to travel through the Negev, which is the desert area, wilderness area, known then as the Negev, which becomes the Sinai desert, known later as the Sinai, into the land of Egypt, because Egypt is a land that is a place of provision during famine because of the Nile River. When the desert area and the land of Canaan has trouble because of a lack of rainfall, the Nile still continues to flood, and so there's prosperity frequently found in Egypt. And so people go to Egypt in times of famine. So that's what Abram does. He stays in Egypt for a while. You can read all about that in chapter 12. There's this just really interesting thing that Abram does was Sarah passing him off as his sister to protect his life. And so we see here that Abram's not perfect, and he makes some serious mistakes, but God continues to work, because God preserves Sarah. He sends Sarah and Abram together out of Egypt. So God is at work in Abram's life, and God is intentionally working to preserve the promises that he has made to make of Abram a great nation. And so now we come to chapter 13, and we see this story continue to develop. And this is our focal passage for today. So Abram went up from Egypt, he and his wife, and all that he had, and Lot with him, into the Negeb. Now Abram was very rich in livestock, in silver, and in gold. He journeyed on by stages from the Negeb as far as Bethel, to the place where his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Ai, to the place where he had made an altar at the first. And there Abram called on the name of the Lord. So in these first 4 verses of chapter 13, we see that Abram leaves Egypt, journeys again through the wilderness, and then moves back to Bethel, where he had made that original altar to God. He comes back and he makes another altar, and he worships God again. So there's this pattern that we are beginning to see in Abram's life, that as he moves, he's a nomad. It's a nomadic lifestyle. He has to move his livestock around, his people around, in order to keep them supplied with food and water. And so as he moves around, wherever he settles, it seems that Abram calls out to God, and he has a relationship with God. Now, this has been initiated by God, but Abraham is responding in faith and worshiping God, and God then is speaking to Abraham. So let's see what happens as this story develops with verse 5. Now Lot, who went with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents, so that the land could not support both of them living together, for their possessions were so great that they could not live together. And there was strife between the herders of Abram's livestock and the herders of Lot's livestock. At that time the Canaanites and the Perizzites lived in the land. Then Abram said to Lot, "Let there be no strife between you and me, and between your herders and my herders, for we are kindred. Is not the whole land before you? Separate yourself from me. If you take the left hand, then I will go to the right, or if you take the right hand, then I will go to the left." Lot looked about him and saw that the plain of the Jordan was well watered, everywhere like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, in the direction of Zoar. This was before the Lord had destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So Lot chose for himself all the plain of the Jordan, and Lot journeyed eastward. Thus they separated from each other. So let's talk about this separation that happens. It's a practical decision that Abram has made. There's not enough land, there's not enough water where they are to support Lot and Abram. They need to separate because they just have too many people and too many herds. And there's squabbles that are breaking out, and Abraham sees this as something to be avoided, and there's a simple solution. They need to divide. So Abram offers Lot first choice, and Lot chooses. They're on a very high place, and they're able to look out and see the land that's spread out around them. And they're able to see, Lot is able to see that is very fertile territory over in the Jordan Valley. And so Lot makes the decision to choose this place because it looks like it's the best. It looks like it's the place where he will have the easiest time, that he will be the most prosperous. And so he makes the decision to take his family, his herds, his wealth, and move in that direction. Now, the biblical writer wants us to know that Lot is moving eastward and that he is traveling outside the boundaries of Canaan. He's moving into a different territory. He's left the land of Canaan. There's a couple of things going on here. Anytime in the Old Testament, in Genesis in particular, when you see people moving eastward, it is a sort of a foreshadowing that they are moving away from God. And so here we have Lot making this decision to move away from Abraham. And perhaps in moving away from Abraham, Lot is also moving away from the influence that Abraham has over Lot. And we know that when he leaves the boundary, the border of Canaan, and moves into the Jordan Valley, that he is moving outside the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, a place of evil. And Lot will not only live outside of Sodom and Gomorrah, but eventually Lot will actually move inside and be affected by the sin and corruption that goes on in Sodom and Gomorrah. So we see Lot separating and moving away from God as he is moving towards Sodom and Gomorrah. But Abraham now is left and is looking around at the land, and God is going to speak to Abraham now, since Abraham has been separated out from Lot, and God is going to come back now and to revisit these promises that he has made to Abraham. So let's pick up and see what God says to Abraham now. The Lord said to Abram after Lot had separated from him, "Raise your eyes now and look from the place where you are, northward and southward, eastward and westward. For all the land that you see I will give to you and to your offspring forever. I will make your offspring like the dust of the earth, so that if you can count the dust of the earth, your offspring can be counted. Rise up, walk through the length and the breadth of the land, for I will give it to you." So Abram moved his tent and came and settled by the oaks of Mamre, which are at Hebron, and there he built an altar to the Lord. So now that Abram and Lot have separated, God turns his attention again to Abram and says, "Abram, look up and look around, and you can have this great view where you can see land that just spreads out for miles and miles and miles. This is yours. I am going to give this to you, to all of your descendants. And those descendants are going to be so numerous, it's going to be like the dust of the earth. If you could count the dust, you can count your descendants." And then God tells Abram to walk this land, to move forward and to travel the land. And of course, Abram is going to be moving his herds and his sheep around, his people around, and that everywhere Abram walks, God is going to give Abram this land. So what we have in this moment, when God comes to speak to Abram again, is that God has revealing more of his promises. God is giving Abram more insight into the promises that he has made to him all the way back in the first verses of chapter 12. God's plan continues to unfold in Abram's life. And Abram continues to respond by faith. He continues to worship God. He continues to seek God. And God continues to meet with Abram and to reveal his plan. Now, at this point, Abram doesn't understand how this all is going to work. He doesn't understand what this is going to look like, and he actually never sees the fulfillment of the great plan that God has for Abram, for his family, for the nation, and of course that is fulfilled in Jesus Christ. Abram doesn't understand all of that. He may have a glimmer that God is working through him, but he doesn't have the full plan. We have it because we have the Scripture. We have the Old Testament, the New Testament, and how it all points towards Jesus. And we see this fulfilled in Jesus Christ. But that's not where Abram was. Abram had just a glimmer. He had an encounter with God, he worshiped God, and he placed his faith in God. And it's interesting, God is working and fulfilling his covenant, and there are obstacles that are going to occur in Abram's life all along the way, all along Abram's journey. Some of those obstacles are Abram's own sin, where he gives Sarah, tries to pass her off as his wife to give him to Pharaoh, to join Pharaoh's harem in order to preserve himself. So we see Abram has these shortcomings and these places where he sins, but God is still faithful and God is still at work bringing about his great plan, and he works in spite of when Abraham makes mistakes and chooses to sin. There are also obstacles, family obstacles. We've got this obstacle in this passage today with Lot, and God works through the obstacles, works through the family, and is able to continue and determined, actually. God intends to fulfill his great plan of redemption. So when we think about this passage and how we relate to it, what can we learn from Abram? The first thing we need to remember is that when we read Old Testament stories, whether they're in Genesis or Exodus or throughout Scripture, that the major actor in these stories, in these biblical accounts, is God. That we are not elevating Abram up and saying, look, we want to be like him. but rather we are stepping back and seeing how God is at work. Now, there are good things that Abram does, and we can learn from those good things, but the primary actor in the biblical story is God. God is the one who is seeking. He comes to Abram. God is the one who speaks to Abram, and God is the one who's going to fulfill his purpose to Abram. Abram has a choice, and that choice is whether to respond in faith. That choice is how, if he's going to accept what God has told him, and then to live according to what God instructs him to do. So let's talk for a few minutes about faith and what that faith would look like in Abram's life, but also what it would look like in our life today. So faith is not just an intellectual understanding or belief. Faith goes beyond an intellectual understanding. If Abram had only intellectually believed that God was speaking to him and believed in the one true God, Abram would never have moved around. Abram would never have set up these altars. Abram would not have called upon the name of the Lord to figure out where God was leading him and taking him next. No, faith has an intellectual component to it as we open our mind, but we also open our heart, our emotions as we respond to the love of God. And then we have the behavior component. We move forward, we act. There is a way that we align our lives with God's purposes and his will because we have faith. So the way I think about it is that faith is directly connected to trust. I trust not in myself, but I trust in God. My trust in God then allows me to come to the place where I am willing to surrender. I release my own agenda. I release my own decisions and turn them over to the Lord and say, Lord, I am yours. I have faith in you. I trust in you. So I am going to live according to your plans and your purposes for my life. And as we respond to God in faith, you will notice that your relationship with God becomes deeper and stronger, more intimate, because you are put in a place where you have to depend upon him. Abram responds to God in faith, and he begins to move, and Abram needs to know the next step that he needs to take. So he takes God as questions, and his relationship with God deepens because he is responding to God in faith. So the same is true for us. When we hear God call and we make the decision to surrender our own agenda, our own will, and we align our lives with God's purposes, it puts us in the place of dependency because we recognize that we have stepped out into a place that we cannot manage on our own. We have questions, we can't predict the outcome, and we recognize our need for God. So we draw closer to God, we listen more carefully, we worship more fully, we pray more fervently, and we seek him. And in those moments, our relationship with God deepens. And it's the result of our faith which leads to our surrender, which leads to this deepening of our relationship with God. So I want to close today with a story that I actually read in the commentary. And it was something I was familiar with, but it brought it back to my mind again. And perhaps you know the story of Eric Liddell. Eric Liddell was a Scottish preacher. He was only 23 years old when he was invited to compete in the 1924 Olympics, which were held in Paris 100 years ago. So Eric Liddell had trained to run, he was very fast, he had trained to run in the 100-meter race and to represent Scotland. And so when he got to Paris to compete, he found out that these heats were going to be run on Sunday. And Liddell felt like that this was disrespectful to God and to his Sabbath day. And so he made the decision, and it was a difficult one because it meant that he would no longer be able to compete, that he made the difficult decision to not run. And he received a lot of pressure, a lot of criticism, but he responded, he trusted God, that God would work in this situation, and he surrendered his own will to do what he felt like God had called him to do. And So he did not compete in the 100 meters, but then the opportunity opened up for him to compete in the 400 meters. Well, he was not expected to do very well in that particular race, but he actually won the gold medal. So he competed in the 400 meters and he won, received the gold medal, and a lot of notoriety, a lot of attention for what the stand he had made, and then for the win that he had achieved, and what the gold medal that he brought back for Scotland. So it's a beautiful story, right? It's a beautiful story, and the movie Chariots of Fire is based on this story, and it is just very heartwarming and inspirational, just this little glimpse of Liddell's life. But the real story actually occurs after he returns to Scotland, because he's successful, he has some fame now, and he's only 23 years old. He has years to be able to compete and to be able to be in the limelight. His success could have been very, very beneficial to him as an individual. But Liddell has heard the call of God to the mission field. And so he turns his back, he turns away from all of his athletic training, from all of the attention that he received in Scotland, and he actually goes to China, where he lives for the next 20 years, and he serves and proclaims the gospel. And there is great influence in China. Many people come to Christ because Liddell has been there working and evangelizing and discipling and sharing his faith in Jesus Christ. Well, Liddell actually ends up spending the latter years of his life in a prison camp. He is in a Japanese prison camp, and he dies there of a brain tumor. But he lives with great purpose, and even in this confinement, he is evangelistic, he disciples, he shares his faith, and he is known as someone who lived with victory all the way up through the very end of his life. And it's interesting to reflect that no one knows, nobody remembers any of those other athletes that competed in 1924. But the world remembers Eric Liddell, and Christians especially know his story because he was willing to act on faith. His trust in God led him to sacrifice his own desires and to align his desires with God, to follow God into the unknown. So the question is for you and for me to consider, are we willing? Are we willing to surrender? Are we willing to lay aside the things that are obstacles to us hearing God and responding? And we stop and we think of the obstacles. We look back at Abram's life and we say, well, what were the obstacles for him? Well, his family was one. The second obstacle perhaps might have been Abram's own sin. He got himself into some jams because he made some decisions that were not good. But yet, all along the way, Abram continued to pursue God with faith. He continued to worship, and God continued to work in Abram's life. When we look at our obstacles, perhaps those are also obstacles in our decisions. Does our family get in the way of us responding by faith and doing what God would call us to do? Does our own sin keep us trapped? Perhaps, but I think it's more likely that our obstacles tend to be just our resistance to change. We get comfortable, we like where we are, and we just sort of shut down the opportunity that God might speak to us and to call us into new and different places, calling us to fulfill our mission as we attach ourselves to his great story of redemption. So as you discuss this idea in your lesson this week, perhaps you can talk about this. What part does your faith play in responding to the call of God? Are you willing to hear the call of God? And how does responding in faith change your relationship with God? Can you share a time when you stepped out in faith and your own relationship with the Lord deepened and grew because you had heard his call and responded? I hope you have a great week, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. May God bless you this week as you pray and study together.